Earlier this past week, President Bush said something in his remarks at the memorial service for the Dallas police officers that has stuck with me as I thought about today's gospel. He said, "Too often we judge other groups by their worst examples, while judging ourselves by our best intentions." As a nation, and even throughout the world right now, as we hear about that failed coup in Turkey, we seem to be doing a lot of this. And I think we're tempted to do that with this text as well. To say, based on how Jesus responds to Martha, that Martha is a bad example, while Mary has better intentions. To say that the moral of this story is that it's better to pay attention to Jesus' teaching than to go out and serve and extend hospitality. That's always bugged me as overly simplistic in a way of understanding this text. To say Martha's bad and Mary's good. Because not only have I known some folks who love to serve, but frankly, I identify myself more with Martha than Mary. Give me a choice between quiet contemplation and service, and more often than not, I'd rather serve than sit there. I suspect the same is true for many of you. And that's because in a culture of hectic schedules and the relentless pursuit of productivity, we're tempted to measure our worth by how busy we are, by how much we accomplish, and by how well we meet the expectations of others. Like Martha, we find ourselves worried and distracted by many things. And yet, as Jesus says later on in Luke's Gospel in chapter 12, can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? So we know that worrying does no good, and that much of what we worry about doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. And yet we can't stop our anxious thoughts and our frantic activities, can we? As in Martha's case, I want to believe that our busyness and distraction stems from the best of intentions. We want to provide for our families. We want to give our children and our grandchildren every opportunity to enrich their lives. We want to serve our neighbors. We may even want to serve God. And honestly, where would the church be without its fair share of Marthas? Without those faithful folks who make the church a working and welcoming community? So the problem with Martha, I think, is not that she's busy serving and providing hospitality. In fact, Jesus just got done commanding us to serve our neighbor in the parable of the Good Samaritan. We heard it last week. Do you remember how that story ended? Go and do likewise. So the problem with Martha isn't her serving. It's not her doing, but rather her worrying and her distraction. Martha's worries and distractions prevent her from being truly present with Jesus, and they prevent her from imagining what is possible with God. You see, in that day, it would be expected that the women of the house would busy themselves to provide hospitality for the guests. But what wasn't expected was a woman taking the position of a disciple, one seated at the feet of Jesus, listening to him teach. So Jesus' admonition to Martha about the better part is not about the roles that both Martha and Mary have, because both the role of disciple and the role of servant have tremendous value in the Gospels. Rather, it's that Mary has seen the possibility of not just doing something different, but of actually being someone different, of being a disciple of Jesus. Mary imagines a future with Jesus that overcomes the boundaries and divisions that our distractions and fears place upon us. And in a world increasingly filled with violence and hatred, at a time when groups are quick to judge anyone who isn't like them, what we need first is the capacity to imagine a different reality, to imagine a world in which Christ can and does reconcile himself to us and to others, as Colossians says today. A world in which peace is made and the cycle of violence is eternally overcome by the cross of Christ. So, what if we saw Jesus' words to Martha as an invitation rather than exasperation, as a sign of affection instead of a rebuke? Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing: to know that you are valued not for what you do or how well you do it, but for who you are as a child of God. And as simple as that sounds, it is good news, because we need to hear that again and again in our frantic society. Because as hard as we try to do the right things as Christians, there are times when what we do just isn't enough to help us focus on Jesus. So he gives us the grace that we need. Grace here in worship, in study, in prayer, to envision ourselves and the world as God intends it to be. Preaching professor Tom Long, he tells a story from many years ago about his service on an advisory board for chaplains at a major university. Their job was to meet with and offer support and advice to the college chaplains. Well, one year after they heard the chaplains' reports, an old rabbi in this council asked them, "What are the university students like morally these days?" The chaplains looked at each other, wondering how to answer that question. Finally, one of them said, "Well, I think you'd be basically pleased. The students are pretty ambitious in terms of their careers, but that's not all that they are. A lot of them tutor children after school. Some work in a night shelter and in a soup kitchen for the homeless. Last week, a group even protested apartheid in South Africa." While she talked, the rabbi began to grin. The more she talked, the more he grinned, until finally it became a distraction to her. "Am I saying something funny?" she asked. The rabbi said, No, I'm sorry. I was just sitting here thinking. You say that the university students are good people, and you're right. And you're saying that they're involved in good and social causes, and they are. And you're saying they're good all around. What I think is missing, the one thing they lack, is a vision of salvation. They looked at the rabbi. "No, it's true," he said. "If you do not have some vision of what God is doing to repair the whole creation, you can't get up every day and work in a soup kitchen. It will finally beat you down. If you don't have some vision of what God is doing, it will finally beat you down." Mary sits at Jesus' feet and listens to his word. She listens to his vision. And without that word, we cannot go on serving. It will finally worry us, distract us, anger us, even exhaust us and beat us down. But with that word, we can distribute food for the hungry month after month. We can care for the sick. We can show a hospitality, true hospitality to the stranger, and keep on loving and living in the name of Christ. So every time you start to worry or get distracted by life, every time we judge others by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions, remember that Jesus has seen us as we are, flawed and sometimes irritable, and often so busy that we forget to see his presence in the everyday moments of our lives. And yet, he still calls to us lovingly by our names. Martha, Martha, Bob, Bob, Frank, Frank. Imagine your own name and hear him call you, reminding you that you are a child of God and that all you really need in life, you already have him. Amen.